Welcome to Paranormal Mysteries, and thank you all for tuning in. And before we start, I'd like to say thank you to Brooke. Your support and generosity are greatly appreciated. If you're interested in supporting us, please consider sharing, reviewing, and subscribing to the show. And if you'd like to take the next step, please visit us at patreon.com/paranormalmysteries or at buymeacoffee.com/paranormal, where you can make a one-time donation. Your support in any form makes the show possible. And if you've encountered the paranormal and you'd like to share your story, please email me at paranormalmysteriesPodcast@gmail.com. All experiences, no matter how big or small, are always welcome. Today's first listener story comes to us from Jessica. Jessica's story is called Wendigo. Jessica says, "Hey Nick and team. I'm a huge fan of this podcast and have been listening to it for the past 7 months, and I am elated to tell you that I am planning on becoming a patron. I appreciate you giving all of us a safe space to share our experiences, and for also being a wealth of information for me regarding other phenomena. My experience begins shortly after my dad passed away in 2007 when I was 12. I don't remember the exact date, but it was a heavy winter that year. I live in southeastern Wisconsin, but at the time I was on a trip in Door County, Wisconsin with my grandmother, my younger sister, and some close family friends. After everyone had settled in, I decided I was going to put on my snow pant overalls and explore a trail that led up some hills. I've always loved walking in nature and was hoping that I'd see some wildlife. My sister decided to stay behind and watch TV, so I was alone, which I didn't mind. I walked for about 15 minutes, and I was on a hill or cliff overlooking a snowy clearing and valley in the woods when I immediately noticed the color of red staining the snow far below. I saw what I thought at first was a shaggy-looking bear with a fresh meal. I'd never seen a bear outside captivity before, and I got as close as I could to the edge of the cliff and watched it as I was laying in the snow. I was overcome with a feeling of bitter coldness to my bones and felt an intense bad feeling or sensation, which I now recognize as sheer terror and dread. My eyes were fixated on the bear, and I was frozen in fear. I saw it lift its head up, and it had long antlers. It was pretty far away, so I couldn't see its whole head, but I saw enough to scare me to my core. It stood probably 7 or 8 feet tall. I said, "What is that?" to myself, which was a huge mistake. It had heard me whisper it to myself, and all of a sudden it was looking right at me. We were locked on each other, and I started to hear whispers in my head, and I felt paralyzed. The whispers stopped after a few seconds, and I got back up and ran as fast as I could, back to the cabin. I could feel it behind me the whole way back, and the wind hissed with what sounded like what I can only describe as unearthly laughter. I busted in the door and made sure that every entrance and even the windows were locked. With my eyes peeled, looking through every window, I told her that I saw something and I didn't know what it was, and she brushed me off, not believing what I was telling her, and my sister probably wasn't even listening. Sorry this was so lengthy, but I've never told anyone about this before, and I wanted to get all the details straight. I have a plan to go up there this winter and investigate further, and try to find it again for proof. I also have experiences regarding spirits, UFOs, aliens, and a dogman. I love the podcast. Jessica. Our next listener story comes to us from Katie. Katie's story is called Personal Paranormal Experiences. Katie says, "Hello. I have 2 separate incidents to share. One happened over a period of several weeks when I was 19 years old, and the second one happened on a night in August of last year. The first event, or series of events, took place when I was around 19, in the house I was living in with my mom and her boyfriend at the time. Now, we had encountered weird happenings before in the house, a little noise here and there, seeing something from the corner of your eye, reasonably harmless stuff. The house was old, having been in our family for 3 generations, so you come to expect the occasional bump in the night. What made this event so noteworthy was the sheer volume of paranormal activity that we had in such a short time. I'll list them off in order as I remember them. Incident 1. My bedroom faced our back porch. We generally turned the back light off once we went to bed because the light would shine right into my face, so I knew it was off when I went to sleep that night. I woke up sometime later to find the back porch light on and shining in my face. I grumbled and pulled the covers over my face and figured someone was up and would shut it off in a few minutes. I listened for the creaking floorboards of someone returning to bed, but never heard anything. I realized that they must have taken our dogs out after I had gone to bed and had forgotten to turn the light out, so I threw the covers off and headed down the hall to turn it off myself. I got to the kitchen where the light switch is located and froze as I saw through the kitchen window that the light was now off. The back porch and backyard were dark. There was no way someone had turned it off and vanished from the kitchen in the time that it took me to walk down the hall. I was a bit spooked, but turned and went back to my bedroom. I entered my room and realized instantly that the light was back on. I did not return to check. I shook my head and buried my head under the covers and stayed there until morning. Incident 2. The next evening, I had been cleaning my car and had dumped the dirty water from the heavy plastic bucket into the grass and had laid the bucket on the back porch upside down to dry. I went inside to eat dinner and relax for the evening. About an hour later, my mother's boyfriend Billy came into the house, mad as a hornet. He demanded that I go outside and clean up my mess, yelling at me for being so destructive. I was confused and stepped outside to find the backyard covered in pieces of plastic. I found the bucket I had just used completely smashed. It was like it had exploded. No one believed me that I had left the bucket in perfect condition, but I know that I did. Incident 3. A few days later, our TV came on in front of everyone in the house. The remote was laying on the table, and no one had touched it. It came on to a channel that was just static. The volume went all the way up, and then it turned off again. When we turned the TV on ourselves, it was on the local news, and the volume was all the way down. We never really talked about it again. Incident 4. Everyone in the house was woken in the middle of the night by a monstrous crash. The impact had sounded like shattered glass, and the windows had shaken in their frames. We had felt it, not just heard it. I got up and explored the house, convinced something massive had tipped over or fallen, but I didn't find anything. Not a single thing out of place, and I never could explain it. Incident 5. A few days after the crash, 2 of our 4 cats went missing. It was bizarre because the 2 that vanished had never been the types to try to get out. We looked for them all day, but couldn't find them, so we went home and resumed our search the next day. I found their bodies the next morning, just after dawn. They sat a few feet apart in the yard, in front of a statue of St. Francis, the patron saint of animals that my mother had in the garden. As I approached them, I realized that something was very wrong. At the most, the cats might have been dead for about 22 hours, but because they had not been there when we went to bed, I doubted that they had been there for more than a few hours. Despite this, they smelled horrible. They were already rotten. We had to bury them right then and there where they sat, as the decomposition was too advanced to move them elsewhere. We called our vet, thinking that he would have an explanation about such a rapid decomposition, but he had none. The weather was warm, but the nights were cool, and I had found them just after dawn. The whole thing did not sit well with me. Incident 6. While home alone with my mother one afternoon, we were watching TV in her bedroom together when we heard someone calling my name from the kitchen area. No one would walk into our house, and we had a huge dog that everyone we knew was scared of. No one would have walked in unannounced. It was a feminine voice, and if my mother had not been sitting right next to me, I would have sworn that it was her. It called out twice for me, but we stayed silent. We found no one in the house when we went to look, a minute or so later, and the doors were all still locked. Incident 7. These last 2 incidents happened within a few hours of each other. My mother's boyfriend was a terrible drunk. He was mean and violent. My mother asked me to record how mean he was, so she could prove to him what he was like when he drank, so I did. I recorded about 30 minutes of him yelling and screaming. After he went to bed, I took the recorder to my bedroom and played a few minutes of it to be sure that I had recorded it properly. It had, and I was just about to shut it off when I heard something else speak. It was a man's voice for sure, but it was too deep to be my mom's boyfriend. The voice was clear and loud, but sounded a little distorted. It said, "Don't fail me." I listened to the rest of the tape, but did not hear any other EVPs. Incident 8. I went to bed shortly after my discovery and went to sleep. I know I hadn't slept very long when I woke up suddenly. I felt watched. I could hear the TV in the bedroom, and I reached down to pet our dog who was curled up by my bedside. I opened my eyes, and on the ceiling above me was a smoky black mass. It was blacker than the darkness, and I was suddenly paralyzed with fear as it began to drop down, closer to me. I was crying, tears leaking down my cheeks as it reached out towards my face. My dog started barking, and the sound broke me out of whatever trance I was in. I screamed and closed my eyes, and I kept them closed until my mom's boyfriend ran into the room to see why I had screamed. But by then, it was gone. I never saw it again, but I've felt it a few times since then, before I left the house. My mother died a few years later, and I left the house for good. Something dark had made its home there, and I'm happy to be rid of it. This last incident occurred in August of 2019. I was living in central Nebraska at the time. 2 friends of mine were acting in a play at the community theater, so I went to meet up with our other friends and see the production, and we had a nice time. I had a glass of wine during the play, and then we all went to get some dinner. Everyone carpooled into 2 cars and drove together. After dinner, where I had no more alcohol, I took my carload of people back to the theater to get their cars, and I sat and talked with my friend Laura in the parking lot for about 30 minutes before leaving. It was just after 9 p.m. when I left, and my friend was right behind me when I pulled up to a red light. I don't remember anything for nearly an hour. Laura claims that when the light turned green, I didn't turn left as I should have, but drove right past my turn and kept going straight. She didn't think too much of it and went right towards her house, which was 30 miles away. The next thing I remember is light in my eyes. I yelped and covered my eyes from the bright lights. It was like I had woken up to a flashlight in my eyes. I opened my eyes again and looked around. I had no idea where the light had come from, and more importantly, I had no idea where I was. My car was parked on a dirt road that ran alongside a field miles outside of town. In the distance, I could see the interstate and the faint lights of town. I was confused and upset, my mind fuzzy, and my phone was dead. I had to use my GPS in my car to find my way home. I had lived in this area for 5 years at this point. I didn't understand how I could have gotten so lost. I got home and plugged my phone in. I had several missed calls and texts from people asking if I was okay. We had a group expectation of letting everyone know you were safe at home for the night if you went out. Everyone else had gotten home, even Laura, who lived the furthest away, and they had still not heard from me. It should have taken me 10 minutes tops to get home. I texted that I was okay, and I went to bed. I was exhausted and still felt weird. For the next 2 months, I was in terrible health, barely able to work, and going to the doctor a few times a month. It eventually faded for the most part, but I feel like that night changed my brain. I don't feel as sharp as I did before. Whatever happened that night scared me terribly. Driving alone at night makes me feel incredibly nervous, and I hate doing it. Thanks for reading my experience, and I appreciate the time and energy you put into the show. Katie. Our next listener story comes to us from Josh, and Josh's story is called Night Terror. Josh says, "So I've been thinking about writing you for a little while now. I found your podcast earlier this year, and I eventually thought that maybe I would share my story with you. I am probably more of a tourist in the paranormal, and by that I mean I come to it for entertainment, but I don't spend a lot of time researching it or digging too far into anything. I am a religious person, but over the years I have found that faith is more important to me than an actual defined religion. My family has strong Christian ties. They are active members in their church, and I still identify as one, but I am open to the ideas of all religions and faiths, and I enjoy learning about them. For me, things like ghosts and demons are something I can believe in as a concept, but I tend to be pretty skeptical about how often people actually experience them. I think it happens, but less often than people think. That being said, I do enjoy hearing about them and I am respectful of others' experiences and tend to ask a lot of questions about it because it is important to me to be there to listen and to try to understand what some people have gone through. Your show gives me that to a point, and though at some times I am the skeptic, there are times I still enjoy getting freaked out a bit. Anyway, here's my experience, and feel free to share it or part of it if you want to on your show. Just a warning though, it is kind of long. This happened in the fall of 2005. It was just a few weeks before I left for my first deployment to the Middle East with the Army. Now, I had been a horror movie fan for most of my life by this time, but this experience terrified me to the point of ruining my enjoyment of horror movies until just the last few years again, something like 15 years now. So that night, my wife and I had gone to sleep like we always did, around 10 p.m., and I don't remember having any problems falling asleep or anything, so it was pretty normal. Also, I am what I've heard called a lucid dreamer, meaning I normally know I am dreaming, and I can even affect what happens in a dream when I want to. That night at some point, I began having the worst nightmare of my life. In the dream, I was laying in my bed, and everything was normal. I didn't even realize I was asleep at first, because it all looked right. Suddenly, I heard a rumbling, like an earthquake, physically coming up the stairs, just down the hall from our room. I jumped out of bed to go slam the bedroom door in order to stop it, as we slept with it open, and I just knew that whatever was coming was evil. My wife woke up when I ran to the door and was screaming, asking what it was, and I was able to slam it closed just in time before anything got in. Then I realized that whatever it was could still come through the upstairs bathroom that had doors to both our bedroom and the hallway that it was currently in. So I ran in there, flipped on the lights, and as I reached the door to the hallway, I could see what was there. What I saw in the already dark hall was a pitch-black formless mass moving towards me, and I got an overwhelming feeling that if it touched me, something terrible would happen. All I could get from it was this feeling of overwhelming malice and evil, but there was just impenetrable darkness, no form. I was able to close the door before it could enter, but I wasn't able to lock it, and the door quickly began to shake in its frame, enough that the latch wouldn't catch, and it couldn't lock. My wife then ran into the bathroom, yelling at me and asking what was out there, while I was fighting with the door, and too afraid to answer. I was, however, able to pull open the drawer in the bathroom counter that was right next to the doorway, which blocked the door from opening any more than 1 or 2 inches. Suddenly the door stopped shaking, like whatever it was had changed its mind, and then I looked at my wife and I realized that I had never locked the hallway door to our bedroom when I shut it. I tried to run back to it, but then I suddenly heard the door handle click and began to open. My wife started screaming, but before we could see anything, I suddenly woke up for real, suddenly back in my bed, which never happens to me. I immediately looked at our bedroom door, and it sat there like normal, open to the hallway and looking like everything was fine, but it wasn't. Now, I'm a big guy, over 6'3", and at the time I was around 230 pounds. Even in my reserve unit, I am significantly bigger than most of the other guys, and I rarely find myself in a situation that I can't handle physically. But at that moment, I was terrified. My house, which we had lived in for over a year, suddenly felt very different and threatening, and I felt like something absolutely did not want me there. Being a good Catholic at the time, I kept a rosary next to my bed, and I grabbed it right away and began praying almost feverishly. I could not shake the feelings from the dream, nor the feeling I was getting now that I was awake. After 15 minutes or so, I woke up my wife and told her what had happened, hoping just explaining the dream would calm me down. But it did not. In fact, when I had told my wife the whole dream, she got creeped out as well. I ended up getting so upset that we had to leave the house, and for the first and only time in my life since, I had to drive to my parents' house and wake them up, just to try and get them to help me calm down. It was a strange thing, being a 25-year-old who was about to deploy to a war zone, and having to go to my mom and dad's house because of a bad dream. My dad was silent about it when we talked, but my mom, who has always been a believer in ghosts, talked it all out with me and my wife, and eventually after an hour or so, we went home. I didn't really get much sleep the rest of the night, nor the next few after that, and I never felt totally comfortable in that house again. Even after 2 tours in Iraq, where I served in active combat, and having dealt with some of the most traumatizing events a person can. When I came home from each tour, I still felt threatened by something in that house. Some black mass that did not want me there. I even would challenge it at times when I was there alone. I would sit in the dark and dare it to come out again. But other than the moments of the hair in my arms and neck standing up, and weird noises, and remember it was a townhouse, it never happened again. About a year and a half after my last deployment, we moved out of that townhouse and built a new one of our own, and we moved again a few years after that as well. In each new house, after settling in, I have always felt comfortable, and I don't feel like whatever that threatening presence was is following me. Afterward, though, I couldn't watch horror movies anymore, especially ones about demons and possession. I had seen a few here and there, but only at someone else's insisting. My brother once got me to watch the first Paranormal Activity, and I was uneasy and looking for spirits and demons everywhere I went for weeks. Recently, in the last 3 months, I have rediscovered my love for the genre, and it's almost like a floodgate opening, because I have been reading about it and watching or listening to shows about it, and my wife has even brought it up to see if it still freaks me out. I truthfully don't even know for sure what changed my mind or feeling about it. Anyway, I have enjoyed your show, and thank you for making this forum for people to get their experiences out there. Truth be told, I am still not sure what I experienced. Maybe it was just the stress of knowing I was deploying, but at the time, I didn't think I was overly worried about it. Even now, thinking back about it, I sometimes feel silly that I let it affect me so much, but then I remember how real it had felt at the time. A funny side note, I have been thinking about writing you for a few months now, and today when I finally decided to, while I was looking up your email on the internet, my computer speakers all of a sudden started to buzz with feedback. I was at work, so I had to stop for a minute to do something else, and when I started looking again, the speakers started buzzing again. That hasn't happened before, and I have had this computer for a while now. Weird. Thanks again, Josh. Our next listener story comes to us from Addie Mae. Addie Mae's story is called Prophetic Dreams. Addie Mae says, "Hi Nick. I've been a fan for about a year now, and have listened to every single podcast of yours. I've always wanted to write in, so now I am. My mother and I both have somewhat of a sixth sense, even though that sounds cheesy, but that's the only way I can describe it. We have a connection. We often think and do the same things without talking to each other. We'll watch the same movie on the same night, even though we didn't tell each other. We'll wear the same outfit without telling each other before we get dressed. She's diabetic, and I keep candy in my purse in case her blood sugar drops, and I often offer her candy when she starts to feel her sugar drop, before she even tells me. These things are a regular occurrence, but our dreams are a little more rare. I had a reoccurring dream of a car crash. It only lasted a few seconds each night. I would be standing on the side of the road in the dark, and a car would come along and run off the road and flip. After 2 weeks of this dream happening almost every night, I slept over at a friend's house, hoping it would go away. Before we went to sleep, I hadn't talked to my mom at all that day, and when we did fall asleep, I had a dream. In this dream, there was a search party for people who had gone missing. We were in the woods, and as I was looking for these people, I found a stream, and over the embankment I saw someone in the water. It was not a big stream, so I jumped down and dragged the unresponsive person out of the water. Paramedics came and brought the person to the hospital. Then I was back with the rest of the search party near this water tower, and there were what looked like fire trucks being filled with water. Then I woke up. I told my friend about this weird dream, and then my dad called me frantically and said he was coming to pick me up. When he arrived, he had told me that my 2 brothers got into a car crash. He told me they had flipped their car into a small stream, and one of them had almost drowned because he hit his head and became unresponsive in the water. The other one also hit his head, but passed out in the car above the water, but remembers seeing our brother with his face underwater. But when they woke up, he had been dragged out of the water into the sandy shore, and neither of them know how it happened. The other thing that happened was while my parents were at the hospital with them, our chicken coop at home had burned down, and fire trucks had come out to put the fire out. Later that day, when everyone had calmed down, I told my mom about the dream. She told me that night, she had been thinking of me, and how she was going to tell me that my brothers almost died, and all of our chickens died. At the time, I was only about 10, so it was hard for them to tell me, but I already knew. I usually brush it off when I think of things before they happen, But this, Nick, I can tell you how freaked out I was when it happened. I don't know if it was some sort of astral projection when I dragged my brother out of the water in the dream, or something prophetic when I dreamt of the fire trucks, and they came. But either way, it's pretty spooky. Sorry this was long, but thank you for reading. Addie Mae. Our next listener story comes to us from Zoila. Zoila's story is called The Boy. Zoila says, "Hi Nick, I have another story for you. I had this experience when I was a kid. My cousin came over for a sleepover. I only had a single bed, so I was laying in bed and she was laying on the floor. It was getting late, so we just turned off the light and we just used the phone flashlight instead. I didn't want to blind us with the light, so I decided to focus the light by the wall near the foot of my bed. But first, here's some quick backstory. My house has always been haunted, and many say that people have seen a family of ghosts there. Anyway, my cousin was telling a story, and I noticed a kid standing at the foot of my bed. I got really scared and I didn't want to scare my cousin, so I didn't say anything, and instead, I just interrupted her story and told her that we should sleep instead. I immediately closed my eyes and hid in my blanket. Then, seconds later, my cousin said, "Why did you do that?" And I said, "Do what?" And she said, "Good one, are you trying to scare me or what?" I told her that I didn't know what she was talking about, and she said that someone had pulled her hair, but I didn't do it. I believe it was that kid. What do you think happened? Anyways, I admire your podcast. It gives me something to look forward to every Wednesday and Sunday. Stay safe. Zoila. Our next listener story comes to us from Natalie. Natalie's story is called UFO Sightings and Missing Time. Natalie says, Utah is a hot state for UFO sightings. Skinwalker Ranch in Toole has many stories, and Corinne isn't much different. I remember the summer of 2015 when I was driving the family four-wheeler with a friend on the back. We went to a friend's house to kidnap her for a four-wheeler ride and breakfast, but she wasn't there. She was with her fiancé. We then started back for my house when my friend and I noticed an aircraft flying low, just about touching the roofs of the one-story houses. It was dark, so we couldn't tell the shape of it, but it had a yellow round light and an orange blinking light on the back. We kept our eyes on it, watching it as it moved slowly. I thought for sure that the people in the house that it passed would see it. I turned my head for literally a millisecond, and when I looked back, it was gone. My friend said that she only turned her head for a millisecond as well. My mom even had an aircraft with a light hover over her and her running partner for 5 seconds before zooming off out of view when they were out running on a dirt road behind our house 5 years before my experience. But it doesn't stop there. In July of 2019, I was a janitor for a contractor at Procter & Gamble. I started sweeping an aisle at 11 a.m. I was fine at first, but when I was at the end of the aisle, I blacked out. My mind went completely blank, and I couldn't see anything, but I could feel my legs moving. All of a sudden, I was at the other end of the aisle, and I was confused at how I got there. When I looked at the time, it was already lunchtime. 5 months later, I was driving home from working a graveyard shift at a restaurant, and I watched a blue light in the sky descend to a shop as fast as a shooting star, and it rested there. When I got closer to the shop, there was the same blue light, but it didn't belong to an aircraft. It was the light for the shop. I was confused at the time, and I still am. Our next story comes from Jasly. Jasly says, After months of listening to your show, I really believe that a lot of the experiences are real, and it makes me feel compelled to share some weird things that have happened to me. It was 2002, and I was living in a little town called Mount Vision in upstate New York with my ex-husband. One night we came back home, and since we did not have neighbors around, he decided to pee outside of the house while he watched the sky. He then said to me, "Look at those 3 lights." On our left-hand side there were 3 lights moving up and down, but at the same time they were moving forward. He was so touched by these lights that he went inside of the house and called his brother to tell him about these mysterious lights. I stayed outside because I knew that they would show up on the right side of the mountain because everything was very dark. Here in upstate New York, nights are super dark. Then suddenly the lights were at the top of the mountain, and paralysis took over my body. I got scared, but I could not run or scream. These 3 lights then formed one light, but it did not illuminate the trees under it, and it came straight towards me. I felt as if I was being examined by this light, and I felt as if every pore of my skin was big, and they could see through me. The light started by my head and went down. I was horrified, and then a thought came into my head. It was something like, "Do not be afraid. I want to know that you are well." But that thought scared me even more. I thought, how can these lights paralyze me, and how do they know me? The light then went down and back up, which probably lasted 2 seconds, but I'm not sure. After the lights finished, they disappeared, and I was able to move, and I ran inside of my house. I was shaking, and I told my ex-husband what had just happened. 2 days after, my ex called me at work and told me to check the news. People were saying that they had also seen these lights the very same night. This is the second scariest thing that has happened to me, and I will share my first experience on another day. I also want to share with others that I can predict things like accidents, danger, or bad energies, and bad people. I can feel their energy or pain, and because of this, when I was living in my home country, I was a card reader. The cards were just an excuse for people to believe me, but the only thing I ever really needed in order to help them was the people's own energy. I no longer read cards, and I am a woman who loves God, and I try to be a good human so that my spirit can go where it belongs. Thank you, Nick, for your wonderful show. It helps us to connect and learn that we are not alone. Have a wonderful 2021, and may God protect you. Jas. Our next story of the night comes from Cadian. Cadian says, I wanted to share an experience I had when me and my mom, my dad, and my little brother went to Fort Wayne to go ghost hunting. There were several teams of investigators there, and one of them lent me and my brother a camera to take into one of the tunnels going under the hills. We wandered around for a bit, and I remembered seeing a brief flash of light on the walls in a sort of vertical stripe pattern. There were some vertical slits in the walls, presumably for soldiers to shoot out of, but it was the middle of the day, and there was nobody outside when I looked. I have no idea what could have produced such a bright light, and sadly, I did not get it on film. Later that day, a man showed us a photograph of me and my brother walking into the tunnel. My brother was to my right, and to the left of my ankle, there was some sort of orb hovering a few inches off the ground. To this day, I have no idea what either of those things could have been, and it may not have been life-shatteringly amazing, but I remember them fondly, and I hope I get to experience more things like that in the future. I would share some more stories, but this email is already getting a bit long, so I will save them for another day. If you share this on the show, thank you so much, and I hope you have a good day. Our next listener story comes to us from Tyler. Tyler says, It was the summer of 2020. In my town, there is an old group of homes, dating back over 300 years, and they are on an Indian burial ground. The place is now a museum, and is open during the day to guests, although it was really easy to sneak into at night. Me and 2 of my other friends did that often, as there wasn't much to do because of the pandemic, so one night, we snuck in, and it was dark. There were no lights there after sunset, and like I said, I had gone there many times before and was never scared. One night, though, we decided to go there, and as soon as we went in, I felt scared immediately, as though there was something I should be scared of. I shook this off as my head playing tricks on me, but the further we went down the path, the more I felt like I was being watched, and the sense of fear grew stronger and stronger. I honestly have never felt so scared in my life, and I've never scared easily. In fact, I've always been into danger. As we continued down the path, there was a big football-sized field. Farm animals grazed there and were usually present there during the daytime hours. As we passed the field, I looked over into the field, and what I saw was unexplainable. What I saw was at least 10 feet tall, skinny with long fingers, and it took on the shape of a human, and I immediately felt like I needed to be scared of whatever it was. I was terrified, but I still tried to shake it off, telling myself that my head was still playing tricks on me. I even believed it until my friend's girlfriend looked over and asked if I had seen it too. I saw the look of immense fear on her face, and I told them that we should turn around, and we didn't run, but we walked incredibly fast. I kept turning around to see if whatever it was still behind us. It was not, but I still felt as if we were being watched. I told my grandmother this story, and she works on the reservation nearby. She said that plot of land was on an Indian burial ground, and that spirit sightings were very common there. She also said that if I felt the way I did when I was there, whatever it was didn't want us there, and I have never gone back since. Our final listener story of the night comes to us from Maeve. Maeve's story is called Healing Hands. Maeve says, "Hi Nick, I've been listening to your podcast for a couple of weeks now. My dad told me this story a couple of years ago, but first, a bit of backstory. My granddad was a very spiritual person, and he was known for having healing hands. His hands were abnormally large, and he was missing a finger on one of his hands, and he had passed away a couple of months before I was born. When I was born, I had breathing difficulties and health complications, so the hospital kept me there for a couple of days to help me recover. The hospital then released me back home, but they told my parents to keep an extra close eye on me because I was still ill. A couple of days passed, and my family were coming over to meet me and give presents to my mom and dad. My dad took a photo of me to put in our old photo album, and once he took the photo, he saw something unusual. He took a closer look at the photo, only to see almost white, ghostly-looking hands resting over my head. My dad laid the picture on his computer. He was quite freaked out about the whole thing, so he went to sleep, and the next day he went to see the photograph again. But it had disappeared. He then asked my mom about it, and she said that she had never touched it. He looked everywhere, but it was never to be seen again. A couple of days later, I had almost fully recovered, and my dad still believes that it was my granddad in the photo, due to the way that his hand looked in the picture. While I was writing this, I felt this safe but unsettling feeling running down my body. Thank you for listening to my story. Kind regards, Maeve." As we come to the end of tonight's episode, I'd like to say thank you to all of you for tuning in and supporting the podcast, and a special thank you goes out to Jessica, Katie, Josh, Addie Mae, Zoila, Natalie, Jasley, Kadian, Tyler, and Maeve for writing in and sharing their experience with all of us. If you'd like to share your thoughts or a similar experience with one of tonight's storytellers, please email me, and I'll be sure to forward your message onto them. If you've witnessed something unexplainable and you'd like to have your story shared on the podcast, please contact me at paranormalmysteriespodcast@gmail.com or visit paranormalmysteriespodcast.com and click on the Tell Your Story link. All of our contact information can be found in the show notes. Until next time, I hope you all have a great beginning to your week, and we'll see you back here on Wednesday with our next episode. From all of us at Paranormal Mysteries, thank you for listening, and remember, don't wait for the unknown to come to you. Get out there and find it.